First film in the series, The Price of Kings, but the second one in this series in the order that OneVoice showed them, because towards the end of January we showed the film on Symonds, which is obviously a look at another sort of totemic leader in this conflict, but with a very different background. I want to quickly introduce our panel, and because the room is relatively small this evening, there should be a good opportunity for a fairly informal conversation and a fair bit of back and forth, and I hope that the film sort of inspired a couple of questions. We've got some opinions I want to share. The first person I'd like to introduce, who we're very lucky to have with us here this evening, to my left is Ambassador Professor Manuel Hassassian. Professor Hassassian is the Palestinian Ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was a Professor of Political Science at Bethlehem University for 25 years and has been President of the Palestinian European American Cooperation and Education Programme. He received his doctorate from the University of Reims in France in 1996, and he's also served as a consultant to the Higher Ministerial Committee for Church Affairs, the Ministry for Planning and International Cooperation, UNESCO, and the Palestinian Negotiating Team on Refugee Final Settlement, amongst other issues. We're very glad to have you here with us tonight. To my right is another professor, Professor Alan Johnson from BICOM. Alan is the editor of Fathom, for a deeper understanding of Israel and the region, a free quarterly journal app and a website, which is going to plug here to my right. And if you have an iPad, actually, it's a very, very nice application to download with monthly or quarterly content. He was a professor of democratic theory and practice at Edge Hill University before joining BICOM in 2011. A senior research fellow at the Foreign Policy Centre. He founded and edited Democratia, a free online journal of international politics from 2005 until its incorporation into Dissent magazine in 2009, where he serves now on the editorial board. He was also the co-author in 2006 of the Houston Manifesto, a modern statement on social democratic anti-totalitarianism, and he blogs weekly at the Daily Telegraph World Affairs. And then lastly, over on the far left there, is Richard Symonds, who is the co-director of the Price of Kings series and the film we saw this evening, replacing at late notice the other co-director, Joanna Nadasagara, who couldn't be with us tonight because she's to fly to Geneva very early tomorrow. Richard is the founder as well as the director and producer at Spur Level Film, and before coordinating The Price of Kings, he co-directed and produced The Fear Factory, which is an expose of the UK's criminal justice system and was screened in the Home Office, the Welsh Assembly, Scotland Yard, and actually went on to inspire a coalition of 60 organisations to lobby for more effective policies in that realm. So I'm going to take sort of the liberty of asking the first couple of questions, and we'll obviously open it up to the floor. And the first question I'd like to ask is to the Ambassador. OneVoice, obviously, we do a lot of work in leadership, and we try and train people in the sort of practical skills around leading communities in such a difficult situation as the ongoing occupation and conflict. The question I have is about Yasser Arafat as a leader and the division between him as a political leader who makes mistakes, who overreaches, who disappoints his people, and the leader sort of that Hussam Zomrat referred to, where there's a picture of him in every home and office in the occupied territories where he's a real symbol. Abu Ammar, I mean, the father of the nation. Does that present a conflict for people to be able to analyse him objectively between this person who's totemic in Palestinian history and society and someone who's also a flawed character in the history of the Palestinian people?
Well, actually, if you trace the history of Arafat, you could say that he epitomized the concept of oxymoron. He was a leader that had all the contradictions that you could think of. I was not really a fan of Arafat, I have to admit that, although my respect to him goes beyond, expressions. And I was always a sharp critic of Arafat, to the point that he managed to co-opt me to give his speech in Geneva. But I tell you that Arafat symbolized the Palestinian national movement. And Arafat's main contribution, with all the calamities that befell the Palestinians, of poor leadership, of lack of judgment, is that he managed to create a Palestinian national identity. And that in itself, I think, could go into the annals of history, not as a president, but as a leader. And we call him Zaim. And there is a difference between an elected president and a Zaim who has a charismatic character. Arafat was a charisma, whether we like it or not. He made terrible mistakes, terrible decisions, But in the final analysis, we cannot really question his loyalty to the Palestinian people and to the cause of Palestine. And since he became the chairman in 1968 of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, I must say that he put the Palestinian back on the political map of conflicts.
But is that almost his greatest success was the first thing that he did? And then in the period afterwards, I mean, is the clarity and honesty that you're displaying there, is that something that you'll find very frequently in the political debate in the occupied territories?
Well, actually, I tell you, Arafat, with all his faults, with all his shortcomings, he is a legend, a hero. You know, we cannot compare, and it is so unfair to compare our president today with Yasser Arafat. Regardless that Abu Mazen was part and parcel of the Fatah movement, but you cannot compare really, you know, our president today with Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat, he could really, I mean, he was so impressive that he could wear the hat of a statesman and the hat of a freedom fighter. And you could never detect exactly how he can switch these roles, you know, and try to impress, you know, people to the point where nobody could figure him out. He is a case in psychology. I mean, it would be very hard really to analyze him. And who are we to sit, basically, and try to understand this man, who for him, you know, Palestine was everything.
That's interesting to see someone in the public eye for so long who still is a little bit of an enigma. Professor Johnson, in as much as there's kind of a duality in the way that Palestinians and sort of pro-Palestinian community see Yasser Arafat, I think it might be sort of a similar situation in Israel. I mean, when I speak to Israelis, particularly Israelis of a certain generation, they'll hold Arafat in sort of a level of loathing that no other Palestinian leader ever had, as a symbol, I think, as much as he's a symbol for Palestinians, it's a symbol for Israelis. Do you think that actually Israelis would be better off with Yasser Arafat as a leader, and what he was able to do to unite factions and to be able to hold a ceasefire and ultimately go to the negotiating table and hold a position?
The short one answer is no. But I think the much more interesting answer was, maybe people missed it, it was very early in the film, and it was Shimon Peres, something Shimon Peres said, which I think was more or less where I think many Israelis would be, which would be, Peres said, without him we couldn't start, with him we couldn't finish. And I think that combination of attitudes is really important. One of the powerful things of the film, I thought, was it's not a great moment in the peace process and hasn't been for some years. There's stasis in the process. I speak as a two-stater. But the film reminded us of how far we've come in a lot of ways. I mean, Peres talked about the days when it was illegal to speak to the PLO, when neither side really recognized each other's right to exist. There was certainly no contacts and negotiations. And the film took us through a process, even though it hasn't landed, and we're in the midst of trying to return to where we were, certainly at Annapolis, where we've made tremendous progress. We should remember that 3 years' worth of negotiations took place as recently as 2007-8. Gaps were narrowed, positions were laid out, the two sides built up some level of trust. That's not where we're at now. I'm not trying to say we are, but it reminds us that it's not that long ago that we came so much of the way towards a solution. I would agree that Arafat did more than anyone to champion and advance the Palestinian cause. I think the film was really about that, and it was very powerful in its depiction of that. If all nations are invented traditions, then no one did more to invent the Palestinian nation and to instill Palestinian identity, which the world recognizes now, than Yasser Arafat. However, I would say that there's a series of qualities that he embodied which, unless the Palestinian national movement moves, transcends the moment in which they were dominant qualities of the national movement, then statehood won't be achieved. I mean, it could be argued that Palestine would now be celebrating its 12th, 13th year of statehood if Arafat had acted differently at Camp David. I understand it's a very complicated debate. It rages about responsibility at Camp David. There's no simple story to tell. But I think there's certain qualities, and they came through in the film: autocracy, a personalism of rule, a kind of attitude towards a mass movement or civil society or civil institutions, which is not the new politics. It's an old politics, and it's not really going to work today. Corruption was mentioned as another one. A culture of hate. I would say, again, not perhaps in Arafat himself, but in terms of the flourishing of a certain discourse and texts and popular culture.
It could be argued as well, and these are many things that the international community in Israel rightly called out the first years of the Palestinian Authority over, and then the rule of President Abbas, Abu Mazen since, as we've seen drastic reduction in incitement and improvement of corruption, complete rejection of violence in Abu Mazen during the Second Intifada was critical of Arafat himself and their conduct. Yet, with those changes in Palestinian political culture, settlement activity continues and fruitful negotiations didn't take place.
Yeah. We have the journal I edit found, we have an article in by Hussein Ibish in this issue. Hussein is someone who works on the Palestinian task force in DC. And one of the things he argues there, which I think is true, and I would agree with, is that if you look at the two sides of the Palestinian national movement in the last 18 months or so, and you ask who seems to have been rewarded and who seems to have not been rewarded, then the messaging seems to have been that Hamas's path of resistance, at least they can tell a narrative that they've been rewarded more than Abbas's and Fayyad's pattern.
So there's a failure of Israeli political culture reinforcing the failure of Palestinian culture.
I mean, I'm speaking more personally now, perhaps. I think one of the great failures has been the failure to support Fayyad and his Fayyadism. I think it was a significant turn to state building, away from the kind of that Hanan Ashrawi was talking about, away from the absence of rule or to rule of law, away from a personalism to institution building, away from corruption to transparency. To me, it was win-win-win, and I think my view is that Israel woke up relatively recently to its failure to fully back Fayyad. I think the Arab states who aren't delivering the money to Fayyad are also to blame, and I think there's some resentments within the Palestinian national movement towards Fayyad which reflect possibly some of those old relationships of co-option and fiefdoms and so on that Hanan Ashrawi was referring to. So there's blame enough to go around, for sure.
A bit of a conflict. Richard, one thing that strikes me watching this, and a couple of weeks ago watching the film with Shimon Peres, will be that the Israeli interviewees speaking about President Peres seem to be much sort of more free-flowing in their criticism of his leadership than seemed to be the case for the Palestinians. I think Professor Hassassian aside, I have seen very few Palestinians in public criticise his rule, but in private I've heard quite a lot of criticism. Did you find trying to make a film that was a challenge in trying to get sort of the full nuance of the individual across?
Yes. You know, people would freely admit that they loved the man, and in fact, Ashrawi said as much as well. That she loved the guy, but acknowledged his flaws. Yeah, very few people. In fact, one of the regrets in the film is that, well, I have in making the film, is that no one would speak on camera about the sort of human rights abuses that led towards the Second Intifada. You know, part of there was, obviously there was corruption. He didn't really make an effective transition to a national leader. He was clearly a brilliant revolutionary, and also very good head of a fledgling state. And I think the legacy of that is a weak leadership, the fiefdoms that Alan mentioned, and unfortunately, well, Hamas taking over in Gaza, all those sort of things came together, and I guess it's that's part and parcel of the lack of open criticism for Arafat. At the time. It was very much of its time. I suppose it's much easier in hindsight to criticise the guy, especially when he's dead. Having said that, he was an extraordinary leader.
And it might not be fair, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. If you're setting up the two leaderships, and the consensus on our panel last time round was quite critical of Shimon Peres.
Yeah.
And again, it was a failure to grasp the nettle, maybe a failure to be able to drive home what many thought were perhaps either charitable as positions or to be a brave leader.
Yeah.
without sort of going into much more depth comparatively between the two, but that sort of willingness to face down extremists or contrarians in our own community, to be brave, to grasp the nettle.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what we learned filming across the first 3 films is that you can't really, the only person who can make those calls is the leader themselves. They're the only people who have the vision and either the confidence or lack of confidence to ride the dragon of an intifada or suppress it. They're the only people who make those calls. And also, it's not strictly fair to compare them because Perez had the benefit of the 70-year struggle that the Zionist movement had beforehand. And he sort of came into a position of power in the early 50s, or was central in government from that point onwards, and was a very good administrator, very good stakeholder. So if you put Perez in the position of a revolutionary leader, having to handle the 70 years that led to 1948 and the independent state of Israel, who knows? I suspect he would not have been, he certainly didn't have the charisma of Arafat, or the determination of someone like Ben-Gurion. And Arafat had never made that transition to being a great leader of a fledgling state. So Perez was clearly very, very good as a second in command at the administrative process. So the short answer to your question is, I don't think you can compare the two. I don't think you can. They're both, I think across the series what we try to do is humanize the notion of leadership and try and really bring to the fore the issues and the difficulties that people have in leadership. And both of those guys face considerable adversity with different measures of success.
Absolutely. Okay, so we can open it up again because the numbers are relatively slight, so people should feel free to stick their hands up.
Do you want the microphone? I can take this moment to. I didn't think we'd need it.
Can we be heard? Is there a need for
yeah,
that?
I think so. Yeah, it seems a bit quieter than I thought.
All right. So, anyone like to ask the first question?
Just switch it on the
No questions.
Can we make comment on what we have heard?
Absolutely, yeah, please do.
I mean, actually, I was responding to your question, but it seems that Anna went a little bit further, started to discuss Abu Mazen, Fayyadism, corruption, and the failure of the national movement and the negotiations and whatever. So let's open the discussion at all fronts, and let's not be confined only to discuss about the history of one man who was, considered to be a national hero for the Palestinians, regardless of his faults. If we look at Arafat today and try to assess what he has accomplished, first of all, comparing Arafat to Peres, with all respect, is comparing apples with oranges. You cannot put these two leaders in that category to make comparisons.
I think I agree with you.
Yeah. Peres could
Let
be...
me throw that respect right back at you.
Peres himself could be discussed as a leader of the Israeli people, and how he managed through diplomacy and what have you to become a political leader with high stature that has been respected.
Yeah.
But to put them in a comparative perspective, I think it's unfair to do that. The other point which I'm trying to make here is very, very clear. As I said, Arafat was the maestro of tactics. Arafat was the father and the author of how to control factions.
Sorry, Professor, when you say the maestro of tactics...
Yes. He did not have the grand design and the vision, because he fluctuated from the liberation of all Palestine to the liberation of the 1967 borders, and he was not really focused exactly whether he wants to coexist with Israel or he wants to drive the Israelis into the sea. Okay? Let's be, here we are frank, and we, in order to be, I'm not going to speak as an ambassador as much as a scholar on this issue. because really it hurts me sometimes when we try, to distort the perceptions without being really true. I'm not a propagandist, and I'm not a pro-Arafatist, neither I'm a pro-Abu Mazen. All right? I'm an ambassador who represents the Palestinian people and their quest for independence. I'm here to fight for their cause. I'm here to raise the awareness of the British public about, a people that has been suffering for the last 62 years under occupation, which is a heinous crime that has been continuing under the bastion of democracy without reaching, anywhere, even when we have opted to go through negotiations. And let me just forget about the era of Arafat and talk about the era of Abu Mazen.
Okay.
Since Abu Mazen came to power, he made it very clear. He said, my strategy is negotiations, and my strategy is basically to achieve an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. And my strategy is not to use violence. And my strategy, I'm willing to negotiate, and I'm willing to go ahead with the international community, and I'm willing to make the historic, painful compromises of accepting a state on only 22% of Palestine. And we were the ones who had really committed ourselves to the first phase of the roadmap, which was, imposed on us by President Bush in 2004. They said, build infrastructure development and security. We have done that. What was the Israelis' position then that were asked to stop settlements? And rightly so, you said it. What was the reward that the Palestinians had to go into the peace process except to see more settlements, more settlers? And today, the problem is no more the Palestinian right of return as much as the basic condition just to go back to the negotiating table, to re-engage, is just to put a moratorium on the building of settlements.
So Professor Johnson, on that, to the ambassador's point, if Palestinian political culture from Arafat comparatively forward to Abu Mazen has been moderating the entire time under intense pressure internationally and from Israel, it could be argued, as the ambassador has done so, that the Israeli political culture has shifted the opposite direction, moving the goalposts the whole time, and making sort of the compromises necessary today insufficient tomorrow.
There's a bit of a myth about Israeli culture, political culture moving to the right. By any realistic measure, it's moved significantly to the left. Again, if you think about the early parts of the film and Shamir and so on, as he's talking there, and compare what Shamir was saying there to Netanyahu's Bar-Ilan speech, in which he accepted the two-state solution. Netanyahu's settlement freeze for 10 months, however we think that was inadequate, or the failure to take it up from the other side. Nonetheless, both of those things put him far away from the greater Israel project of the 70s and the early Likud years. That's a significant shift. The annexationists currently in Israel are a minority, and they did not...
They're a minority, they're going to be in the Israeli government in the next few weeks.
Well, they did not do well with the election. I was in Israel for the election, and the real story of the election was what didn't happen. There was a prediction in the Western media that Israel's going to the dogs, it's all going off to the right, the religious people, the extremists are taking over, the peace process is finished. Actually, that's not what happened. In the middle of the day, on the day itself of the Israeli election, panic began inside the Likud, is what happened. And Netanyahu took to Facebook, and some of the leaders took to Facebook and other places to say, Likudniks, put down whatever you're doing. That's actually what they said. Put down whatever you're doing and go out to vote. But there was a panic, and we could pick it up. We were picking up all sorts of issues that Lapid was rising. Meretz, as the left-wing Zionist party, had doubled its vote. I spoke to a very excited Meretz new MK at about 2 o'clock in the morning who thought maybe there'd be a centre-left government, which was never quite going to happen, but you could understand her excitement at that moment. The Lapid party that we went to was euphoric. This is a centre-left. Now, I'm not saying that the peace process, he ran on the peace process, he ran on domestic issues.
Yes.
But nonetheless, if you read the speech that Lapid gave in Ariel, now he gave it in Ariel, that's interesting.
Also controversial.
But what he said was also interesting, which is that he would only enter the government if serious moves were made towards peace. That this was not a problem I'm willing to hand on to my children and grandchildren. Livni has been brought into the government. I think this is significant. I don't think it's just part and parcel of coalition negotiations and she's going to be sidelined. Netanyahu has brought Livni into the government, and he's, at this point at least, things can change in the coalition haggling, but at this point at least she's going to be in charge of negotiations with the Palestinians with a brief to reach a settlement. Now, whatever we think of the chances of that, she has a track record without going on of serious negotiations for a long period of time. She's essentially come back into politics to do this thing. So that again, it may not get us all the way there, but it's some way from the predictions of a Naftali Bennett, Netanyahu Lyndon government. So in that sense, in the immediate short-term sense, it was a move to the centre-left. You just need to look at the balances of the numbers in the Knesset. And in the longer-term sense of where we were, say, in the 70s, to where the political culture is now, with the widespread acceptance of the two-state solution, that's a significant move. I mean, I just say a couple of other things briefly. One of the people who we worked with at BICOM was Tal Becker. Tal Becker was one of the main negotiators from the Israeli side at Annapolis. And Tal says something which I think is just worth saying how difficult it is to reach these conclusions. And Tal used to say there's kind of 6 things going on at once. I mean, there's 2 sides to the room. On your side of the room, you have to have enough agreement with everyone else on your side of the table. Then your side of the table has to have enough agreement with the people on the other side of the table. And then both sides of the table have to have enough agreement going backwards to the people back home, the voters or the constituencies and so on. And one of the things he said was, that's difficult enough in and of itself to find the right alignment of the stars, so to speak, so that all those 6 things are aligned. But also it's a question of, can you write the other side's victory speech? You used to have that question. Can you write the other side's victory speech? Can you reach out in your mind to what the other side need to make a success of it? I think there's 2 interesting things at the moment where we're at. One is, I think, challenges for both sides. The challenge for the Palestinian side, I think, is, can they make this about the 67 file? And I know this is controversial, and it's not a case of saying, we don't say anything about the 48 file, but can the question of the right of return be managed in negotiations in such a way that means what's left at the end of the day is a Jewish majority state, and what's left is a Palestinian national movement that feels its experience in 48 has been recognized, that there's been humanitarian returns of people, that there are programs, for instance, which President Abbas talked about recently, of visits and so on to villages where he grew up, but nonetheless it's part and parcel of the solution. I think as long as, I think the international global solidarity movement plays a negative role here, as long as it's about full, untrammeled, absolute right of return, then negotiations, it's very, very hard to see how negotiations can succeed. On the Israeli side, I think it's, the thing that worries me most is not so much the settlements, because I think the blocks take up some 80% of the settlers. The blocks have been part of any serious end of settlement negotiations. It's possible to have land swaps, which take in the major settlement blocks, one-to-one compensations of land go to the Palestinians, and as for the hilltop people and the crazies and the youth and the taggers, they can take care of themselves, or be taken care of. That to me is not just the issue, is Jerusalem. I think the Palestinians have been asked to make one historic compromise in terms of 22% of the land, the mandate Palestine, another historic compromise in terms of right of return. I actually think to expect the Palestinians to make a 3rd historic compromise and not have a capital in East Jerusalem is a historic compromise too far. And one of the concerns about some of the building projects, for me, is much less to do with somebody builds an extra kindergarten in settlement as Jerusalem.
Just on that point, just quickly, because I want to put that back to the ambassador. We had criticism from Israeli and Palestinian speakers in the film about Arafat's decision to go to the 67 borders. I mean, to Professor Johnson's point about the 48 versus 67 files, to go to the 67 borders as being the first position, the first compromise, so that there was, I think to quote one of the speakers, no fallback position. Do you think that that has made the political culture in Palestine quite difficult? I mean, to the professor's point about directly confronting the issue of refugees, being able to speak about compromises that might be necessary because of the gap between where the public is and where the leadership went very fast.
I want to be a practitioner and not a theoretician. Okay. I want to share with you my personal experience in 52-second track negotiations with the Israelis. So I'm sharing with you something, not something theoretical, but something that I felt it when I was negotiating with the Israeli side. Look, the 6 issues that we refer to as permanent status issues are all important issues. And we cannot say one issue is more important than the other. It's like a Catholic marriage, organically intertwined, there is no divorce. And that's why one of the basic failures of this peace process is that we have succumbed to the idea of incrementalism. Incrementalism was a recipe for disaster. Because if we wanted to look at the issues stage by stage, we were stuck in the secondary deployment. And what we have seen, more building of settlements, settlers, Israelis, we have managed to get every single issue that is considered to be outstanding, we managed to get a negotiated settlement. And I tell you, it's all there in the Muqata'a, and it's all there in the Prime Minister's office. But the problem here is that, you know, our leadership may be both sides, and I don't want to be biased against the Israelis, although, you know, I don't trust this Netanyahu, all right? With all respect, they're not ready to make peace because they lack the political will. And this is the culture that you were talking about. The culture of peace was never inculcated in the Oslo peace process. As a matter of fact, Israel was jockeying to build more settlements because they thought that this peace process will give them, you know, the time to go ahead and continue the building of settlements, which is, you know, the accomplishment of the messianic dream of Eretz Israel. And to come and tell me that, you know, these elections, you know, has shifted from right to center to left, in the final analysis, my dear friend, the Zionist ideology reigns still supreme in the public of the Israelis who have, in the past, elected, you know, extreme leaders, conservative leaders, leaders who are not willing to make the historic compromise. And here where I have to make my comment. I think regardless of Arafat being, you know, a slick, and he managed to play, you know, the international politics, and he was never corrupt, but he was a corrupter. And with all the faults of Fatah and what have you and authority, one thing we have really to admit here is the fact that when Abu Mazen made his pledge that we would like to have a Palestinian state, and that state should be on the borders of 1967, believe me, he meant it. You know, today the situation in the West Bank, on the political level, we're passing through a stage of Proudhon, what he says, anarchy. Because we cannot envision what will be the policies of the Israelis on the other side. And because of that, this uncertainty, the political uncertainty, makes us even more skeptical.
But you can say that that's a mirror image. I mean, many Israelis will look at the leadership of Hamas in Gaza, and they will say the same thing.
I'm coming to that. There is one consensus here, which is very important, between Hamas, Fatah, and all the Palestinian factions. End of occupation. The rest is academic, my friend. To come to grips, you know what is the problem in the Musalah and the reconciliation? Is whether we are going to use proportional representation or are we going to use, you know, these are the things that Fatah and Hamas are discussing. They're not discussing the issue of the peace process. Because Hamas also understands at the end of the day, armed struggle is not going to pave the way for the independence of Palestine. They know it.
I think there's residents of southern Israel that might sort of think slightly differently, but regardless, I think I saw some hands going up there, so it's a question for the floor, yes?
So, okay, yeah, I was just commenting generally. I mean, several polls show consistently that, you know, the majority of Israelis, the majority of Palestinians believe in a two-state solution based more or less on 67 borders, and everyone knows more or less what that solution will look like. So I find it kind of depressing that, you know, everyone knows what the solution is, but it never happens. And I guess one of the reasons is that the general publics of both sides don't trust each other. So while, for example, the Israelis say we believe in two-state solution, we don't think that the Palestinians believe that we think, oh, most Palestinians want to take over the whole land. And while the Palestinians will say, well, actually Israelis look at the building the settlements, so they don't actually believe in two-state solution either. So I think both sides have pretty good legitimate reasons to distrust the other in a way. I mean, like, I guess the Israeli narrative is, okay, there's also a flawed narrative, but they would say, look, okay, we pulled out Gaza, we've got rockets, so therefore they don't want to make peace. And then the Palestinians would understand to say, well, look, they're just building settlements, so how can you say you believe in a two-state solution? So I guess my question is, maybe for the ambassador or Mr. Professor Johnson, is to what extent do you think both publics are responsible for that lack of trust on the other side? So.
Let me very briefly add, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I think there's two distinct problems on each side. With Israel, you've got a lack of political will at the very top. But I think recent events have certainly the election, that we'll see how that pans out, that might change. And on the Palestinian side, you've got a problem with political capital. The leadership just doesn't have the political capital of the people. It's quite, I think, Abbas, well, Fayyad never got the support that he was due. And there's a whole, in fact, Hassan, the leadership that we came across, there were two distinct levels, sort of 60-plus-year-olds, and then this sort of level of guys who are, I want to say, 35 to 45. And they're trying to break through, and I think they could do a fantastic job of it. But I think the old guard is a problem.
Maybe you should about the Israeli side.
No, I'm talking about Palestine.
Oh, sorry.
And the lack of political capital of the current leadership, the old guard in the Palestinian town, they just can't pull their people together. And conversely with Israel, you've got a lack of political willpower. However, that, I think in the current elections, you've seen that might change a little bit. We'll see how that pans out. And I hope Livni's an important appointment. She's Minister of Justice as well. Yeah, and that's, I don't know about you, Alan, but I've always thought that the judiciary in Israel have been the last hope. They're the guys who sort of pull the right wing back when they need to. They're the guys who say, sorry, that's a can't do it. So I think Livni, in that particular appointment, with a mandate to prosecute a peace process, would be quite a powerful combination. So, you know, there's some light in the tunnel. There may be a fair bit of pain to go, but there's some light there.